Congressional Procedure: A Practical Guide to the Legislative Process in the United States by Richard A. Ehrenberg, Chapter 8 of 9, Additional Congressional Responsibilities and Procedures. Table of Contents, Introduction, Nominations, Recess Appointments, Treaties, Congressional Oversight, Investigations, Impeachment and Trial, 25th Amendment, Legislative Veto, Recess and Adjournment, Senate Morning Business, House Special Orders, Rulings and Appeals of Rulings of the Chair, Expelling a Member or Denying a Seat to a Member-elect, Presidential Election, Presidential Succession, the Courts, Amending the Constitution, Review Questions. Introduction. In addition to legislative powers granted in Article 1, Congress has a number of other obligations under the Constitution. Some of the most important are actually contained in Article 2, which creates the executive branch. Article 2, Section 1 conveys to the President the power to nominate with the advice and consent of the Senate, ambassadors, judges, and executive branch officials. See Chapter 8.b. The President is also empowered by the Constitution to appoint executive branch officials and judges in Congress's absence. Chapter 8c. Article 2, Section 1 gives the President the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. Chapter 8d. The responsibilities to concur in the ratification of treaties and particularly the obligation to participate in the appointment of federal judges have been at the center of considerable political debate in recent years. Two other activities of importance discussed in this chapter are the congressional role in oversight of both the performance of the executive branch and the private sector in carrying out the laws, and the related congressional responsibility to investigate matters where abuse of power, scandal, and wrongdoing or malfeasance are charged. One tool used by Congress to maintain control while at the same time delegating responsibilities to the executive is the legislative veto. The Supreme Court has held the mechanism in most of its forms unconstitutional, but Congress has continued to use legislative vetoes. Article 3 gives the Congress important duties with respect to the judiciary, including establishing courts and other than the Supreme Court, see Chapter 8Q, and determining the jurisdiction of all federal courts, with the exception of limiting the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction. This chapter also discusses the responsibility given to impeach a president when warranted, and the power to remove that president by trial in the Senate. See Chapter 8G. Congress has also provided an important role should removal of the president pursuant to the 25th Amendment be undertaken. See Chapter 8H. The Constitution grants Congress important responsibilities in the counting and certification of electoral ballots in presidential elections and the authorization of Congress to legislate regarding the line of succession to the presidency. The procedures to be followed in the event of a presidential vacancy are established both by constitutional provisions and secession laws passed by Congress and signed by the President. See Chapter 8O and Chapter 8P. Article 1, Section 5, which allows both the House and the Senate to write their own rules and is a provision of crucial importance to the independence of the Congress, further enhances the independence by assuring that only the House and the Senate may deny a seat to a representative elect or a senator elect, respectively. Also, only the House and the Senate are empowered to remove a member from their body. There is no other way to deny a member or member elect their seat in the Congress. See Chapter 8 9. Article 5 places Congress at the heart of the process of amending the Constitution. This far reaching power, shared with the states, does not involve a role for the President. See Chapter 8R. Several important elements of congressional procedure are discussed in this chapter, including the differences between the congressional recesses and adjournments. See Chapter 8J. Rulings by the presiding officer and successful appeals to such rulings play a key role in both chambers, but particularly in the Senate, where the body is more likely to overturn its presiding officer. A recent example was the use of the nuclear option in the Senate to change the precedents related to cloture votes on executive branch and judicial nominations. See Chapter 5I and Chapter 8B. Finally, this chapter explains the practice of permitting senators to speak on any subject during a period called morning business and a procedure in the House known as special orders, allowing members to make short speeches after the House has completed its legislative business for the day. See Chapter 8K and Chapter 8L. See also related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. B. Nominations. The Constitution provides for shared power between the President and the Senate with respect to nominations to high executive offices, including the Cabinet, and to all federal judicial nominations. Congress may determine whether lower level executive nominations require Senate confirmation. There are more than 1,200 executive branch positions that currently require Senate confirmation, including department heads such as secretaries, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, and general counsels, leaders of independent agencies such as administrators and deputy administrators, and members of boards and commissions, such as commissioners. Presidential appointments of U.S. attorneys and U.S. marshals must also be confirmed by the Senate. Promotion, Promotions of military officers are also confirmed by the Senate most routinely. Every 4 years following presidential elections, the Senate and the House alternate in publishing a book length listing of politically appointed positions entitled Policy and Supporting Positions, printed by the Government Publishing Office, more popularly known as the Plum Book. The Plum Book is named for its original cover color, although appreciated for the double meaning. The Senate alone, with stability in mind, was chosen by the framers to share the power to appoint judges and executive branch officials with the President. James Madison wrote at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the Senate is to consist in its proceeding with more coolness and with more wisdom than the popular branch. In fact, the word Senate derives from the Latin senatus, meaning an assembly of wise old men. French political theorist Alexis de Tocqueville, in his classic work Democracy in America, observed in the exercise of the executive power, the President of the United States is constantly subject to a jealous scrutiny. He may make, but he cannot conclude a treaty. He may designate, but he cannot appoint a public officer. The process of confirming presidential nominations begins in the Committee of Jurisdiction over the agency involved. For example, all ambassadors and the Secretary of State would be considered in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Attorney General in the Judiciary Committee, and the Secretary of Defense in the Armed Services Committee. Hearings are held to evaluate the qualifications of the nominees. Typically, the nominee and others supporting or opposing the nomination may testify. Often, senators will use these opportunities to extract promises to take certain actions, if confirmed, from the nominees. Commonly, chairs or other members of the committee will seek a commitment during the hearings that the nominee, if confirmed, will agree to testify before the committee when requested to do so. This hearing process plays an important role in facilitating congressional oversight of the executive branch. Nominations may be reported favorably, unfavorably, or without recommendation to the full Senate by a simple majority vote of the committee. Senate Rule 26, 7A requires that a physical majority of the committee be present when the recommendation is made and that a majority of those present approve the recommendation. Hearings by the Senate Judiciary Committee are held to consider the qualifications and temperament of judicial nominations made by the President. Judicial nominations also require a simple majority vote to be reported to the full Senate. Like executive branch nominations, they may be reported favorably, unfavorably, or without recommendation. They may also be simply ignored at this stage. Some judicial nominations in recent years have languished with or without hearings for years, mostly at the will of the Judiciary Committee chair. A recent example was the handling by the Senate Majority Republicans of President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to be a Supreme Court justice. Within hours of the news of the death of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia on February 13, 2016, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky, vowed that the Senate would not take up any nomination that the president might make, stating, "The American people should have a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice. Therefore, this vacancy should not be filled until we have a new president." President Obama ignored the majority leader's advice that he make no nomination, and on March 16, he nominated Merrick Garland, the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, to fill the Scalia seat. Backed by the Senate majority and Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley, a Republican of Iowa, the majority leader successfully stonewalled the Garland nomination. After Donald Trump was elected president in November and took office in January, he nominated Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Democrats, believing the failure to consider President Obama's nominee was unprecedented, launched a filibuster of the Gorsuch nomination. With only 52 Republican senators at the time, it was unlikely that the 60 votes necessary for cloture could be reached. Majority Leader McConnell eventually used the same parliamentary tactic that his Democratic predecessor, Harry Reid, a Democrat of Nevada, had used to create a Senate precedent reinterpreting the language of Rule 22 as requiring only a simple majority to end debate by invoking cloture, extending its effects to Supreme Court nominees. This was the so called nuclear option. See Chapter 5.1. Supreme Court confirmation hearings have become major public events and can be quite contentious. In recent decades, hearings for Supreme Court nominees have garnered intense national interest and often live television coverage. Once hearings are concluded, the Committee of Jurisdiction votes to report the nomination to the full Senate. Favorably, unfavorably, or without a recommendation, the committee may also choose not to act on a nomination. A nomination reported to the Senate is placed on the executive calendar. See Chapter 5C. The Senate considers nominations in executive session as opposed to legislative session. The Senate proceeds to executive session by motion or unanimous consent to take up nominations or treaties on the executive calendar. By precedent, the motion to proceed to executive session to consider a specified notion, wherever it may be among the nominations listed on the calendar, is not debatable. Routine nominations may be called up en bloc and confirmed by unanimous consent. Nominations that have not been acted upon when the Senate adjourns or recesses for more than 30 days, or when it adjourns sine die, are returned to the President. When a nomination is called up, the presiding officer poses the question: will the Senate advise and consent to this nomination? The nomination is confirmed by simple majority vote, a quorum being present. For much of its history, filibusters of the nominations in the Senate were rare. In recent years, as the level of partisanship in the body has increased, it is not uncommon for the opposition to the president to oppose some of his nominations. If the president's party is in the majority in the Senate, the minority not infrequently employs a filibuster or threat of a filibuster to delay a nomination. Filibusters of Supreme Court nominations remain comparatively rare. Cloture has been sought only 5 times, including the nomination of Neil Gorsuch. Before Gorsuch, cloture votes were required only on the nomination of Abe Fortas in 1968, at least in part due to ethics problems that later caused Fortas to resign from the court. Twice on William Rehnquist when he was confirmed as an Associate Justice, and again when elevated to Chief Justice in 1971 and 1986, and Samael Alito in 2006. Supreme Court nominations are particularly high profile, and the mere possibility of a filibuster being employed often has some effect on the president's nomination decision in the first place. Presidents anticipated, because of the supermajority 60 vote requirement to invoke cloture, that their nominee would likely require some votes from the minority party or votes from the opposition if the president's party were in the minority. This may have and often appears to have had the effect of presidents avoiding some nominees. The same applies to circuit court and district court nominees, but often in less publicized fashion. This change between this change beginning in 2013 when Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Democrat of Nevada, employed the parliamentary tactic that has been called the nuclear option. See Chapter 5H and Chapter 5I. The majority of the time Democrats the majority, at the time Democrats, was successful in establishing the precedent that the words of Senate Rule 22, ending debate requires a vote of 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn. Was to be understood to require only a simple majority of all executive branch nominees and all judicial nominees below the level of the Supreme Court. In 2017, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky, executed the same parliamentary tactic to extend the precedent to cloture on Supreme Court nominees. This brought the Democratic filibuster of the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court to a halt. The changes in the Senate's interpretation of the number of votes needed to invoke cloture means that a president, if his party is in the majority in the Senate, will only require the support of his own party to conform judicial nominees to lifetime appointments on the federal courts. As former Senator Richard Lugar, a Republican of Indiana, observed, if nominating and confirming judges becomes a purely partisan affair, it will be far more likely that judges subjected to such proceedings will feel less inclined to uphold strict norms of impartiality and nonpartisanship. See Chapter 5, see Chapter 5H and Chapter 5I. See also related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com.